Okay.
Welcome. It's good to see everyone. It's a pleasure today to have with us Kevin Trainer. He's a professor at UVM in the Department of Religion, and his area of research includes, see if I say this right, Kevin, Theravada Buddhism.
Theravada. It's a hard T.
Theravada. Okay, Theravada. And especially he's been focusing on Buddhism in Sri Lanka. And he's spent 2 academic years, right, Kevin? 2 academic years there, plus made a number of other trips there. So he knows Sri Lanka, and he'll be sharing what he knows with us. And so welcome, Kevin, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jane. It's a pleasure to be here. Welcome, everybody. So we'll just get started here. So I'm going to begin not where you would expect in Sri Lanka, but I'm going to begin in England. And that's because contemporary Sri Lanka, or is it Ceylon as it was called until 1972, really can't be understood without taking into account roughly 150 years of British colonial rule. So from 1796 to 1948, Sri Lanka was under British colonial domination. It's actually had 450 years of European control, beginning with the Portuguese for about 150 years, then the Dutch for 150 years, and finally Great Britain until they gained independence in 1948. So what you see here is a shot of the British Museum, and on your left is the reading room of the British Library. This became a major repository of knowledge, but also of objects, artifacts that came in from the colonies throughout the empire. And we're going to take a quick look at one of those images. So this is from the contemporary exhibit in the British Museum, which has a large collection devoted to South Asia and a major new exhibition, including objects that came from Sri Lanka. And so on your left, you see a picture of the kind of signboard which presents Sri Lanka at the British Museum. And what's interesting is that it focuses on religion, noting that Buddhism came to Sri Lanka from India in the 3rd century BC. Hinduism, another religious tradition, came roughly the same time. And it then goes on to talk a bit about different dynasties or political regimes beginning in 300 BCE, so more than 2,000 years ago, very, very long time ago. I think the thing to take away from this is that there's a strong linkage between religion and politics. So from the very beginning of the political order in Sri Lanka, Buddhism was deeply tied up with it, as we'll see when I move ahead here. I think the other thing to note here is why it was that Sri Lanka was such an important place historically. And here I'm referring to the fact that it was colonized by 3 different European powers because of its natural resources. So it was partly that it had really excellent harbors, and also that it had a huge gem trade and also spices. So it's often referred to as a spice island. And it was cinnamon that was one of the reasons that the Portuguese and the Dutch were drawn to control Sri Lanka. All right, so moving quickly to this image, the image you see in the center is in the British Museum. And in fact, it kind of holds pride of place within this exhibition of South Asia. It's an image of the goddess Tara. Bodhisattva, complicated. I won't go into the kind of religious background of this. What I'm interested in is the fact that this image is in England rather than in Sri Lanka. And what you see on the right-hand side is the replica of the image that you can find now in the Colombo National Museum. The Colombo National Museum is up there, shown in the top right-hand side. A museum that was established under British colonial rule. which, as you can see from the architecture, looks kind of British, at least it does to me. And it notes that the original object is in England. Without going into too much historical detail, the way that it got to England is contested, but essentially it was brought by the Governor General of Ceylon, who was responsible for capturing the Kandyan Kingdom under British rule. Allegedly, the object was found by archaeologists and then made their way to the governor. Many in Sri Lanka think that he stole it during the siege of Kandy. And there are others calling for the repatriation of it. So it's a contested object. And I think my reason for starting here is that Sri Lanka today is inseparably influenced by the history of colonial rule, particularly the fact that English is as widely spoken as it is there. Most of the major institutions, educational institutions, go back to that period of British rule, much of the infrastructure. And then much of what has happened since 48 in lots of respects has to do with responses to that colonial past. So the emergence of Sinhala Buddhist nationalism, which is a kind of major dimension of contemporary Sri Lanka, I think can't be understood apart from that history of colonial rule. So I just wanted to kind of frame things in relationship to this complicated history. Okay, so we're going to begin in Colombo, which is the capital. It is where the major international airport is, Bandaranaike International Airport. This is where tourists fly into the country. Generally speaking, somewhere between 2 and 3 million tourists come to Sri Lanka every year, although that number was brought down to 500,000 in 2020 because of the pandemic. I don't know how many were able to come in 2021. Why do people come to Sri Lanka? Well, the thing that is most attractive to many people are the beaches. So the entire island is ringed by glorious beaches. And it's a very popular tourist destination site, particularly in the winter months in Europe, for people who want to capture some sun. Ironically, I spent very little time on the beaches in Sri Lanka in my time there, but beaches figure very prominently, and I'm going to drop some beach pictures in as we move along, because I think as I look out the window and see the snow, seeing some warmth is definitely welcome. Okay, so we're beginning in Colombo. This is a picture of the Gall Face Hotel, which is the major surviving colonial hotel built in 1864. And at the time that this was built, this was a site of great luxury. And many, many famous people, when they've come to Sri Lanka, have stayed in the Gall Face. I've never actually stayed there, but there is a veranda restaurant, and it's a lovely place to sit and have tea. And that's what you see here. I'm here with my son, Andrew. This is in 2010. So Andrew was born in Sri Lanka. We adopted him in Sri Lanka in 1997. And we're able then to go back there in 2010 with him accompanying us. So when I was on a Fulbright grant there doing research in 1997-98, we adopted him. And he's going to figure prominently through these pictures along with my wife, Anne. When we first visited Sri Lanka in 1985 to 86, I was on a research grant from Columbia University doing my doctoral research. And we went to live in a small village called Eldenia, not too far from the capital of Colombo. And we went there because I was working with a professor of linguistics named Professor Karunatilaka, who was undertaking to teach me Sinhala, Pali, both Sinhala, written Sinhala, and spoken Sinhala. And so the picture you see here is from the small village where we were staying in 85. This was the market. And when we wanted to buy groceries, we went to the market and used our rudimentary Sinhala to try to sort out the transactions. So our experience in Colombo has varied dramatically from this kind of village experience you see here. This is a shot from the neighborhood in 85 or 86, I don't know which. And an itinerant gypsy came by and he pulled out his basket with his cobra. And you can see him charming the cobra here, much to the delight of the children in the neighborhood. It gave me the creeps, to be perfectly honest. I'm not a big fan of cobras, particularly since they live in the neighborhood. So you have to be very, very careful about snakes when you're living in the village contexts in Sri Lanka. We came back in 1991 and for summer research time, and this is our landlords, Mr. and Mrs. Arya Ratna. And I wanted to give you a sense of kind of the changing experience in terms of domestic life that we've experienced. On the left-hand side, you can see Anne sitting at a desk in the room that we were renting at the time in 1985. And you can see that it is air conditioned, which is to say that there's air coming through the window. It's very hot in Colombo. It's, typically around 80 degrees and the humidity is usually around 80% as well. It can be quite oppressive. On the right-hand side, you can see the Airbnb accommodations that we had in 2016. And there you can see my computer, you can see the air conditioning unit above the window, and things have changed dramatically. That's partly changes that have occurred in Sri Lanka over the course of that period of time in terms of development, but it also has to do with our changing economic situation as I went from being a poor student using a manual typewriter in 1985 to being a professor who was, well supported, with research funding. This is the place we stayed in 2016. So this is in a very nice section of Colombo. Again, as I said, we rented it over Airbnb. And here I just thought you'd be interested in the comparisons between kitchens. So on the left-hand side, you see our kitchen in 1991. Very rudimentary. We had a propane cooker or gas top stove on your left, and we had a sink, so we had running water, and so relatively speaking, those were very good accommodations. But on the right-hand side, you can see the kitchen in the apartment we rented in 2016. A little bit different, definitely a different kind of accommodation. We're back to the beach here. So as I said, we spent very little time at the beach, but beach photos are gonna kind of pop in here as we move along. All right, I've mentioned that I'm a scholar of Buddhism, and many of the sites that we're going to see are associated with the history of Buddhism in Sri Lanka. And my own particular research is focused on relics, that is to say the physical remains of the Buddha and how those are the focus of religious devotion. There is a tradition, a widely accepted tradition, that the Buddha during his lifetime, and again, this would be in the 5th century BCE, that he made 3 visits to Sri Lanka. And of course, he had supernatural powers, so he could fly. And he flew over from India to Sri Lanka, and he visited a number of sites. And in a sense, you could say consecrated them. In other words, his physical presence in those sites made them important places. Eventually, there came to be 16 places identified, and that's what you see in this map. You don't obviously need to worry about the details. I think the thing to notice, though, is that the places are located all around the island. And this has a great deal to do with the identification between the government, which is Sinhala dominated, which is the majority community, and the patronage of Buddhism. There's a strong connection between politics, political legitimacy, and the Buddhist religious tradition. So as I say, there are 16 sites that became identified as places that the Buddha visited, and then these later became places where relic monuments or stupas were built. And you can see them depicted here. This is a picture of a silver manuscript cover. And it actually, you've only seen 15 of them here, but there are 16. And so there are all those little, stupas or relic monuments, with the exception of 3 places, including, I don't know if you can make this out, but there's a kind of, the third from the left is a mountain. And on the top of that mountain, if you look closely, you probably can't see it very well, there's a footprint, and there's an elephant climbing up the stairs to the footprint. So that is Sri Pada, or Adam's Peak, which is a major pilgrimage site. People climb up to the top of the mountain in order to venerate the marks in the rock cropping at the top of the mountain. Buddhists believe that this is the footprint of the Buddha that goes back to when he visited Sri Lanka. Hindus believe it's the footprint of Shiva, and Muslims associate it with Adam. So the interesting thing is that three different religious traditions come to this place as a site of pilgrimage. They just disagree over whose footprint it is. So we're going to visit Tripada a little bit later today. Okay, so of the 16 different sites, we're going to start with Kelaniya Temple, which is quite close to Colombo. Here you can see on the left-hand side the image house, which includes images of the Buddha. And then before that, the white building is the relic monument. And on the right side, you can see a group of Buddhist devotees who are circling around the stupa. So the practice is that you keep your right side facing the stupa because that's the size of respect, and you circumambulate or walk around it as a sign of veneration. On the left is the entrance to the image house, and you can see a group of schoolgirls who were there on a kind of visit to the temple as part of their school day. And then on the right-hand side, you can see a drummer. This is a man who is performing a kind of formal ritual of offering of sound, offering of music to the Buddha, who is represented in the images inside the image house. Religious practices in Sri Lanka, Buddhist practices are closely associated with the full moon day of the month. Those are days of religious observance. So people typically go to temples on those days. And here you can see Kelaniya Temple, the stupa, with the full moon in the background, and people kind of in the kind of evening next to these lit lamps venerating the stupa. On the right, you see a close-up of a person making a flower offering to the Buddha at that stupa with the oil lamps in the foreground. Back to the beach. Just give you a moment here to enjoy the sun. Okay, so we're going to move now from Colombo to the eastern coast of Sri Lanka to a place called Trincomalee. I actually was able to visit Trincomalee for the first time in 2016. So even though my research was kind of related to a Buddhist monastery up in the east, I was never able to visit because this was a major site of the civil war that took place in Sri Lanka between 1983 and 2009. So this was an area of major military contestation. It was not safe to go there. The war ended in 2009. And in 2016, I was able to go visit Trincomalee and to visit this temple that I had been studying remotely for a long period of time. What's distinctive is that this section of Sri Lanka is very multi-religious and multi-ethnic. So Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists all live in this area. And here you can see a major Hindu temple in Trincomalee. This is the sign, the entrance sign, and you can see that it's printed in 3 different languages. On the top left is Sinhala, the language of the majority community. Below that is English. And then on the left-hand side, the right-hand side is Tamil. Tamil being the language of the community that's predominantly Hindu. So you can see the large sign reflects the fact that the majority of people coming here are Tamils. So these are 2 images in Trincomalee. One is on the left-hand side, the image of the demon king Ravana, who figures very prominently in the Hindu epic, the Ramayana. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the god Shiva, who is one of the major Hindu deities. Back to the beach in Trincomalee. So one of the reasons that prior to the Civil War, tourists visited beaches in different parts of the island depending upon the weather because of the monsoons which come in. There's 2 different monsoons that come in. When the monsoons are hitting one part of Sri Lanka, it was possible to go to the other side of the island and enjoy the beaches. So there are beach resorts on the East Coast, though they went into pretty serious decline during the Civil War, and there's been a lot of effort to reestablish them in the post-war period. Okay, so now we're going to go to Anuradhapura. There are a number of different sites in Sri Lanka that are UNESCO World Heritage Sites. One kind of major focus is what's called the Cultural Triangle. And it's called a triangle because it includes the city of Anuradhapura, which you see the arrow pointing to. Right below that is Palanarawa, another major city that we'll visit along the way here. And then you can see further south, Kandy, so Matale and Kandy. So those three cities together form the three parts of the triangle, which are recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site. They're major archaeological sites and strongly linked with Buddhism. Okay, so Buddhism came to Sri Lanka in the 3rd century BCE, and the place that, in a sense, it touched down, if you want to put it that way, is a place called Mahintale, which is what we're going to look at now. Mahintale is one of my very, very favorite places in Sri Lanka. It's a major pilgrimage site. You can see here the stairway that leads to the top of this hill/mountain. The temple is on top of it. There's something like 1,800 steps. This is my wife Anne and my son Andrew climbing to the top. It's a major pilgrimage site on the day of the month called Posan, which is the day that commemorates the arrival of Buddhism in Sri Lanka. I mentioned that Buddhism is multi-ethnic. To give you a kind of basic idea, the population is between 22 and 23 million people. Majority community are ethnically Sinhala. That's about 75% of the population. They are overwhelmingly Buddhist, though there is a small minority of the Sinhalas who are Christian. The Tamil community, which is ethnically from a different region of India, it makes up about 15% of the population. And again, a small percentage of that is Christian, but the overwhelming majority of Tamils are Hindu. And then there is a population of Muslims of about 10% in Sri Lanka. Their ethnicity is complicated. They're often called Moors, linked to their origins in Indonesia. They came to Sri Lanka as part of the trade routes, with Sri Lanka being a kind of major site. Okay, so anyway, and then in addition, there's a small indigenous community called the Vedas. The main thing is that the government of Sri Lanka is strongly identified with the Sinhala community and with Buddhism. And so Buddhist nationalism is a kind of major political force. The development of the Civil War had to do with the domination of the Sinhala majority community over the Tamil community. It was a separatist movement by the Tamils who wanted to set up a separate nation. So basically, in short, ethnic relations are complex and often quite tense in Sri Lanka. So moving to a more pleasant topic, you can see an image here of the Buddha. This is at Mahintale. As I said, this is one of my favorite places, and I visit it every single time I come to Sri Lanka. Here you see the relic monument that is believed to mark the spot where Buddhism literally sat down in Sri Lanka. The tradition is that it was brought by a monk named Mahinda, who used his supernatural powers to fly to Sri Lanka. And he met the king, Devanam Piyatissa, and he converted him to Buddhism. And so following that, the Buddhist king then kind of established this kingdom in Anuradhapura, which was the original capital of Sri Lanka, as I say, strongly tied up with Buddhism. So this is believed to have the relics of the monk Mahinda in it. And you can see those pillars circling it. Originally, the stupa was covered by a roof that was supported by those pillars. Another site at Mahintale is called the Bed of Convocation, and this is where Mahinda is said to have given his first sermon in Sri Lanka from the top of this rock. And as you can see, Buddhist devotees climb up the pathway and make their way to the top. course, this is all done barefoot because this is considered to be a religiously sacred area, and so you remove your shoes to respect its purity. Another major focus for Buddhists is the Bodhi tree. And here you can see a painting of it from Kelaniya Temple, which shows Mahinda's sister, who was a nun named Sanghamitta, bringing over the Bodhi tree branch from India, where it was then planted in Sri Lanka. I don't know how much you know about Buddhism, but the tradition is that the Buddha gained enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, which is a particular species of tree, in India at a place called Bodh Gaya. And so this is said to be a branch of that original tree from more than 2,000 years ago, which was then planted in Sri Lanka. And it's a major focus of religious devotion. Here you can see the entrance to the Bodhi tree shrine with people lined up to go in and to pay their respects to the Bodhi tree, which is considered to be a kind of a manifestation or representation of the Buddha. Restoration of Buddhist monuments is a major focus of the Buddhist community. And here you can see, this is from 1986, a group of women who are participating in the renovation of this temple by handing up bricks from down below. And you can see there's a what do you call a fireman's brigade, where brick to brick is being handed from person to person all the way up the side of the relic monument. That's what it looks like today. So they completed the restoration. It's a beautiful monument, beautifully maintained. And again, it's important to see how the Buddhist-focused government provides material support for these renovation activities. Another really, really large stupa in Anuradhapura. This is called Abhayagiri, about 300 feet tall, and you can see it's still in the process of being renovated. So you can see the scaffolding around it. There is an even larger stupa called Jetavana. It's about 400 feet tall, and these two monuments, built, before the Christian, so BC, before the Christian era, were larger than all but two of the Egyptian pyramids. These are really massive constructions, and they're earthworks. So there's a chamber inside that was opened for the establishment of the relics, and then it was closed up. So these are not things that you go inside. They're major monuments that are mounded up of earth and then plastered over on the outside. Okay, so Anuradhapura and Palanarua are part of what's called the dry zone in Sri Lanka. The northern section of Sri Lanka is very arid. And those civilizations that I've been referring to, based in Anuradhapura initially, were possible because there was a major effort to build reservoirs and collect water. And so what you see here is the reservoir in Anuradhapura, which is dated back to the 3rd century BCE, allegedly. And this kind of collection of water was the basis for irrigation works that made it possible for these civilizations to function in a very inhospitable and dry area. All right, so now we're moving down to the city of Palanarua. Because of invasions from South India, the capital in Anuradhapura in the 10th century moved to Palanarua. And Palanarua is a place that had a strong integration of South Indian and Sri Lankan influences. So Hinduism was represented there, Buddhism was represented there. It is likewise on the UNESCO World Heritage Site. And so there's extensive archaeological ruins there that tourists go to visit. But my interest in it here is a set of sculptures, Buddhist sculptures there, at a place called Galvahara. And this is, along with Mahintale, one of my very favorite places in Sri Lanka. Ideally, you get there in the early morning before the sun really becomes harsh. And there are 4 images carved into the rock face. These were constructed in the 12th century. And they show the Buddha in 3 different postures. They show him standing, as you can see on the left. They show him reclining, and then on the right side of the picture, you can see the full extent of his reclining body. And they also show him, well, standing here again, and then seated. And these are popular places for people to come in religious devotion. But it's also just an extraordinary place. I don't know how to describe it, but it just has a very serene air about it. Okay, so another major tourist destination, as well as archaeological site, is the temple at Dambulla. And it's famous as a rock temple. The earliest temples where Buddhist monks resided were usually in rock caves. And this is a large cave dating back to the 1st century BCE that became a place where a major Buddhist monastery was established. There are 5 caves here. And here you can see a sign similar in a way to the one that we saw earlier in Trincomalee at the Hindu temple, warning people about how to behave. So there is, you might say, a kind of an easy relationship between these sites, many of them which are sites of religious devotion for Buddhists, and there are certain rules of decorum that you're expected to observe. And tourists who come and visit them on their vacations, who are there for very different reasons, not for reasons of religious observance. And they have a complicated relationship. But there is a lot of concern that the sites be properly respected by tourists. And you can see in this interesting English, whether any religionist. So what this says in effect is whatever your religion, a person with manners behaves in a gentle fashion. In other words, in a respectful fashion. And unfortunately, I think this is a response to the fact that many tourists do not necessarily respectfully visit these sites. Just to give you an example, a Buddha image is regarded to be, in some sense, the real presence of the Buddha. And so you don't turn your back on it. In other words, kind of do what most tourists do, which is they want to take a picture of them with the Buddha. So they kind of snuggle up to the Buddha and take a selfie. You're not allowed to do that. And people have actually been arrested for doing that because it's considered to be enormously disrespectful. So again, on the right, you can see the cave entrance to the cave temples. The left, you can see my wife, Anne, and Andrew, my son, with a young boy. And the boy in orange is a young Buddhist monk. On the right-hand side, you can see inside one of the cave temples and the sculptures and paintings on the ceiling. It's a very, very beautiful place. Not far from Dambulla is another major tourist attraction called Sigiriya, which in Sinhala means the Rock of the Lion. This is a site that dates back to the 5th century, and it was a fortress built by King Kashyapa I. So he was based in Anuradhapura. The story goes that he killed his father in order to gain succession to the throne, and allegedly he walled him up alive. And then he fled to this rock fortress where he had a palace built on the top of it. Again, another UNESCO World Heritage Site. Some think that he regarded this as a kind of celestial palace. So it was though he had ascended up into the heavenly realm. And there is a stairway that leads up to the top. So when you visit the site, you can climb up this long stairway that leads you to the top. And along the stairway, there are beautiful wall paintings, wall frescoes that are preserved from that period. And in the lower right-hand side, you can see one of those paintings. These are these 2 maidens. There's debates about whether they represent women or whether they represent female goddesses. I think maybe the more persuasive theory is that, these are the celestial figures who are sort of hovering around this heavenly palace at the top. This is the entrance to the stairway. You can see that it had the footprints of the feet of 2 lions. And I think probably there was a lion's head further up, but it didn't survive into the present day. But this is how you climb to the top. You go between the two footprints of the lion. Here's a view from the top, and you can see the reservoir where the water was kept to make water supply available for the palace. And we're back to the beach here. Okay, so next we're going to go to Kandy, which is in the central part of the island. So we're moving from both Polonnaruwa and Anuradhapura are very dry. We're moving into the central highlands and a more mountainous part of Sri Lanka, which is much cooler, very different sort of vegetation, lots of rainfall. Kandy was the center of the last kingdom in Sri Lanka until in the early 1800s it was captured by the British. So it's often thought of as kind of the last preserve of traditional royalty and the Sri Lankan monarchy. So it has a lot of kind of political significance. It's also the site of a place called the Temple of the Tooth. So it's believed in Sri Lanka that after the Buddha died in India and was cremated, his teeth survived the cremation, and one of them made their way to Sri Lanka. And it is believed to be enshrined in the Temple of the Tooth in Kandy. And that's what you can see in the distance there with Kandy Lake in the foreground. This is a painting from Kelaniya Temple showing the coming of the tooth relic to Sri Lanka. The tradition is that it was brought in the 4th century by a woman named Queen Hemamali and her husband, the Prince Dante, and she smuggled it into Sri Lanka in her hair. So you can see in this picture at the top knot, there's a little halo, and that's the tooth relic which she has hidden in her hair. It eventually makes its way to Anuradhapura, where it's enshrined, and then at each point that the capital moved to Polonnaruwa and then to other places later, the tooth relic was moved with the government. It's considered to be a source of political authority. Ultimately, it ended up in Kandy, and when the British captured Kandy in 1815, they seized the tooth relic. This is the Temple of the Tooth in Kandy today. Obviously, it's a major focus of importance for Sri Lankan Buddhists. It was also the focus for a terrorist attack in 1998. So the separatist movement exploded a bomb in front of it. There was a lot of concern that it would have destroyed the temple. It actually did a lot more damage than most people know, but it was an attempt to attack the government in its connection with Buddhism. It has since been restored. So what you see here is the restored version of it. Also in Kandy is a beautiful set of gardens called the Royal Botanical Gardens, founded by the British in 1843, in which they put all sorts of different examples of vegetation and plants as a kind of botanical garden. So it's partly in service of knowledge, also in service of sort of the cultivation of plants, but it's also an extraordinarily beautiful place to visit. You can see here the beautiful gardens. I'm standing there on the left in 1986, and on the right you can see a close-up of an orchid. There is a huge orchid house with an amazing collection of orchids which are kept there. All right, not far from Kandy is a place called the Pinnawela Elephant Orphanage. Sri Lanka is also known for its animal preserves. So different parts of the country, areas are set apart for preserving particular animals and wildlife. Sri Lanka has a lot of elephants, and there is a place called this orphanage where they put elephants, often babies, which have been separated from their herds and their mother, often under tragic circumstances where poachers have killed the elephants or During the conflict, elephants were killed from mines and various other things. In any case, there are 100 elephants kept at this orphanage, and it's a very, very popular tourist destination. You can see the elephants every day are brought down to the water where they can sport and cool off. You get a nice picture there of a baby elephant with the mother's trunk over the top. And there's a baby elephant and my son Andrew, and the baby elephant being fed. Elephants are an animal of great prestige in Sri Lanka and in South Asia generally. They're associated with royalty, so often kings would have elephants, or they would use elephants in military campaigns. There's also associations with the life of the Buddha. Kandy is famous for its annual procession of elephants, in which the elephants carry the tooth relic around the streets of Kandy. This is a major procession. This picture, it's a little bit hard for you to make out, I'm sure, but the procession takes place at night, and so the elephants are lit up. There's also torches. There are dancers, jugglers, other performers. As many as 100 elephants participate in this. So it is quite an extraordinary spectacle, and many tourists come to see this during the month of July or August. It depends on when the full moon day falls, whether it's July or August. Oops, sorry, wrong direction. And back to the beach. I think we're running out of beach pictures here. This is my wife and a good friend who visited us from the States in 1986. But I think you can see here these extraordinary sunsets. I mean, the beaches are one of the attractions is you get just extraordinary sunsets, often with very dramatic skies. Okay, Central Hill Country. So again, the central area is mountainous. One of the other major products in Sri Lanka is tea. So you may have heard of Ceylon tea. They've held on to the Ceylon name because it's got a strong name recognition. The British in the 1800s built or established tea plantations, particularly in the Central Highlands, because the quality of the tea improves with the higher elevations. And what you're seeing here is you can see the beautiful countryside. Again, very lush, a good deal cooler than it is down in the lower parts of Sri Lanka, particularly around the perimeter in the beach areas. So the hill country became a major refuge for British nationals during the colonial period. Tea plantations was one reason that the British came there. And you're seeing here a former tea bungalow. This was one of the managers of a tea estate, lived in this house, which is now a place that can be rented out. And so my wife and I stayed there. But this gives you some idea of colonial era architecture. You can see wide verandas for people to sit, particularly in the evening as it gets cooler. And you can get a sense of the colonial architecture. It's really a very, very lovely house. And one of the things that was developed under the British was something called the planter's chair. And then you see my son here relaxing. It has two extensions that come out from the arms so that you can put out, so that you can put your feet up and kind of sit back and sip your gin and tonic after a hard day. They're here. My wife and Andrew are playing Scrabble, enjoying the planter's chairs. I mentioned the tea industry. The shot on the left shows the tea country. I'm afraid it's not a very good picture, but you get some sense of these rolling hills completely covered with tea bushes. And then on the right-hand side, you can see a tea picker. The community of tea pickers are exclusively Tamil, and women are the pickers. This goes back to the British, who brought over large numbers of Tamils to work in the tea plantations. They couldn't get Singalas to do it, And so there was this substantial group brought over in the 1800s. And they continued to be the people responsible for the picking of tea. Here you can see a tea factory where the tea is processed. Just need a quick drink here. So I mentioned that the hill country was an area of retreat. This was typical in the colonies that, often in India, Sri Lanka is very hot in the major areas of colonial administration. So the wives and children would go up into the cooler areas in the hill country where there were resorts built. And this is the town of Noora Elia, which was a major British resort. You can see this is the post office there, and it's built in a kind of 19th century Victorian bric-a-brac style. They could grow roses, they could grow vegetables that were native to England, so this was a kind of retreat. It's also a place where they had a place called the Hill Club, which was an exclusive club, and a racetrack. So this was a major retreat for the British. They also built a lovely golf course, and this is the golf course that was built in the 1800s, 18 holes, really just beautiful. I don't play golf, but it's very, very beautiful. All right, so I'm going to quickly go through these next slides. We're moving to Sri Pada, which is in the hill country, a major pilgrimage site. You can see here a pilgrim vehicle. This is bringing pilgrims to the site where people climb to the top of this mountain. It's about 7,400 feet. And there is a pathway that leads up to the top of the mountain. It's fairly arduous. It takes, depending on your fitness level, anywhere from 2 to 4 hours to climb up to the top. You typically climb it during the night so that you can be on top of the mountain for the sunrise. So I went with a group of people from the American Embassy in 1986. We stopped at this place called the Upper Glencairn Rest House, and we sort of rested in the evening, enjoyed some tea as we were waiting to begin the climb about midnight. And here is an aerial shot, this isn't my picture, of the temple at the top of the mountain. So I don't know if you can make it out, but in the foreground there, you can see that kind of line from the bottom of the picture up to the top where the orange roof is. Those are all people. So this pathway becomes absolutely crowded with people shoulder to shoulder climbing up to the top of the peak during the days of great religious holidays. So here we are at the top, kind of huddling together because it's about probably 55 degrees up there and we're used to 80 degrees, waiting for the sun to rise. So we're on the temple kind of stairs facing east, waiting for the sun. This is a picture of a person venerating the footprint. This is a Buddhist monk. You're not allowed to take a picture, so I don't have any pictures of it. I got this from the internet. Anyway, here's the sunrise. You can see it's still dark. This is the moment that the sun is just cresting the mountaintop. And this is a time when everybody kind of shouts out sadhu, sadhu, sa, which is a kind of respect to the sun. And it's believed the sun is venerating the footprint of the Buddha. Now, there's an interesting phenomenon that occurs. People go around to the west side of the temple and look down upon the cloud cover below. And that's what you see here. And then if you're lucky, you get to see the phenomenon of the peak. And I don't know if you can make that out, but in the center, there's a kind of triangle. And that is the silhouette of the mountain cast by the sun as it comes up over the horizon. So the cloud have to be just right for this to happen, and we were really lucky. So the one time we climbed, we got to see this. And this is another stupa, and this was established by a Japanese Buddhist monk in 1976. It's a peace pagoda. I think this might be the final beach shot. This is my son Andrew in 2010 with Lalit Madige, who is my collaborator in Sri Lanka. Finally, last site is the city of Galle in the south. Major harbor, also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It was a key port. There was a fort built there by the Portuguese in the 16th century. When the Dutch took over in the 17th century, they fortified it. And what you see here is on the keystone is the date 1697. This goes back to the Dutch period when they built this part of the fort. And here's a shot within the fort. And this shows you a mosque in Sri Lanka. So I wanted to kind of capture sites for all the various religious traditions. Okay, moving along. So as you can see, for me, Sri Lanka has a great deal of personal connection. It's always very much tied into my family, to the members of my family, as well as part of my work. I'm going to close with 3 pictures. This is a picture that was taken in 1998, just after we adopted our son, Andrew. He was only about 4 or 5 months old here. This was in Mahintale, as I said, my favorite site. And then when we went back in 2010, we reproduced the photo. So that's Andrew, 12 years old, in the same site. And I'm happy to say that Andrew was able to go back to Sri Lanka in 2021 with a UVM study group and without his parents. So he went to Mahintale, and this is his teacher and a friend of his in the group recreating the photo in 2021. So I'm hoping to get back to Sri Lanka. I was supposed to go in 2020, but the pandemic made that impossible. But I'm retiring at the end of the semester, and I'm hoping I'll be able to get back there, if not this summer, then the following year. I'll stop there. Do you have any questions?
I was curious about the current relationship with the Tamils and the government. I haven't heard much, and you said there's still tension?
Yes, there's plenty of tension. I would say at present, the tension is more pronounced with the Muslim community than with the Tamil community. But in the post-war period, since 2009, the military continues to be strongly represented in areas that are predominantly Tamil. And I guess you would say there is an uneasy truce. Nothing was really done to resolve the causes of the attempt for secession for the Tamil community. And the current government is strongly Singhala Buddhist nationalist. So things are not particularly good, I guess I would say, but there's no conflict. I mean, the war is over. To a great extent, the separatist forces were killed. I mean, there was massive loss of life at the end of the war. Other questions?
I was curious about food and transportation.
Okay, so transportation, most people who don't have access to cars get around by public transportation. There's an extensive government-supported bus system. So buses that run between cities, lots of buses in Colombo. Colombo is a major metropolitan area. The buses are enormously crowded, very, very uncomfortable and extremely cheap. So they have the virtue of going everywhere and of being extremely affordable. But consequently, you'll have people hanging from the windows. I mean, there can be an extraordinary number of people in a bus. Our first couple of times there, we took the buses a lot. When we no longer had to, we were quite happy to no longer have to take them. There's also private bus companies with minibuses, and they also run along parallel with the public transportation buses. Likewise, extremely crowded, and because they're Japanese buses, and they're very, so when I would take those, I would have to be extremely hunched over because I couldn't stand up in them. And then you inevitably almost never got a seat. You were always standing. There's an extensive train system that was built by the British, which is, it's quaint, I guess you would say. It's wonderful to take a trip on the train up into the hill country, but it's also very, very slow going. I think the biggest change maybe by way of transportation is that when we first went there in the 80s, very few people, relatively speaking, had cars, and now a lot more people have cars. The traffic is horrendous. So transportation is fraught. It can be quite difficult. Most tourists arrange to have some kind of tour take them with a car and driver to places, or with buses that are set apart for tourists to visit different areas. Food. Sri Lankan food is quite diverse. It's like other aspects of South Asian cuisine. There's a lot of similarity. So the typical meal is what's called rice and curry. So rice is the kind of basic staple that forms the kind of carbohydrate base of the diet. And then there is a curry sauce. And curry is actually a spice. It's not a particular kind of food. It's refers to the spicing of it. And all kinds of things can be put: vegetables, meats, seafood. It tends to be very spicy. So like South Indian cooking, lots of chilies. Coconut is also a really fundamental part of it. So coconut milk, coconut oil is used in the cooking. And it's also, the food in Sri Lanka is also influenced by the 3 European powers. So you can find dishes that have been influenced by different ethnicities from Europe. So I think it's delicious. I love Sri Lankan food, but it's very spicy. And people traditionally eat with their hand. So they would use their right hand to eat, scooping the rice and putting it in their mouth. So, I mean, restaurants, forks and knives, et cetera, are very, very common. But traditionally, when we first went to the village, we needed to learn to eat with our hand. And I'm left-handed, so, you have to use your right hand, and using your right hand was a bit of a challenge for me, but got used to it.
Did you ever see the show with Anthony Bourdain when he went to Sri Lanka?
No, I'd like to see that.
I think it's Parts Unknown, but beautiful photography, and Beth, he talks about the food there.
Yeah, I'll have to track that down.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. That was really interesting.
Oh, good. I hope so.
That you could show us the contrast too, or how things have changed from the 80s to now.
Yes, thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah,
Oh,
me too.
I'm so glad.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. Thanks. Yes.